Welcome everyone to our next slot. What can I say? We're dealing with two of the world experts on this particular topic, straight out of Chicago. It'd be Patrick Jagoda and Ashlyn Sparrow. And I'm going to pass the mic over to them on online theater and ARGs. As usual, you can throw questions and comments up in the chat. And if you got links that go elsewhere, put them in the works cited section in Discord.
Thanks so much for having us. Thanks to all of the organizers and the participants. This has been such a great symposium so far. Ashlyn and I are really grateful for being here. So we're just going to talk a little bit today about one particular case of a game that we created in March of 2022 and ran with 350 middle schoolers, but we'll get to that over time.
So we are a part of a kind of transmedia collective called the Forecast Lab. This consists of not only just me and Patrick, but also our colleagues, Heidi Coleman, who's in Theater Arts and Performance Studies, Mark Downey, who's in Cinema Media Studies, Kristen Schilt, who is in Sociology, and then we have our filmmaker, Ben Kolak. And so all of us together work on these pervasive games, these transmedia games, and more specifically, alternate reality games. And so just to make sure that we are all comfortable with the terms, alternate reality games are a form of transmedia storytelling. They're not really bound by just one singular medium. So we will incorporate text and video and audio and scavenger hunts and Discord and Twitch and all these different things to kind of make the experience. Stories are usually more discrete pieces, and people will work together to kind of piece together what the narrative is over time. They'll reconfigure it and we'll kind of play back with our players. It's all networked and participatory and collective, so a lot of the times our players are working together to figure things out. And the final thing, which is really the big thing when it comes to ARGs, is we have this entire aesthetic where it's focused on this is not a game. At no point do we tell our players that this is a game. They might suspect that it's a game, but at no point are we like, yeah, it's a game. We just keep it moving, and we'll continue to like world build, and at any moment that they think they've reached the edge of the world, we will expand it ever so slightly.
And we've been doing this kind of world building since about 2017. So these are the pieces that we've worked on since then. Each of these games had a major theme. So the Parasite was focused on diversity and inclusion at our university. So it served as the orientation game for 1,800 incoming students at the University of Chicago. Terrarium took that same concept and applied it to climate change, the question of what it means to make a game and kind of seed a problem that a generation of university students might be able to take up across different disciplines and might be able to hack away at to some degree. Labyrinth and Echo were both entirely live streaming based because they happened at the very beginning of the pandemic and were meant to sort of like help players have a social world at the moment of like total lockdown in mid 2020. And then Duck Variations was a game for a private client. And then Scene is the game that we'll focus on today. It was our return to climate change again, but this time with middle schoolers. So part of the question was, what does it mean to produce playable theater for that particular age group, which is extremely savvy when it comes to different technologies, but also differently playful, let's say, than an adult audience or an audience that's accustomed to going to the theater, for instance, and is now pivoting in this slightly different direction. Ashlyn already talked a little bit about the composition of our team. I'll just emphasize that people were coming from many different areas, including game design and filmmaking, but also we had content specialists for this game. So we were able to bring in some world-renowned researchers really working in climate change and adjacent areas in order to teach the students something about climate change, but also engage them as characters in the game.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the narrative. So in this game, we had these characters called the Keepers, and they're curators of what we call the possibility space. This is essentially this kind of multiverse where we understand that there are different possible futures that the Earths might have. They identified this threat called the darkness, and what it was doing was going around and destroying all these possible worlds. And so us at the Forecast Lab, we needed help to stop and thwart the darkness. And so we recruited students from across Chicago to kind of help learn about these possible futures, how they were affected by climate change, and what they can do to kind of help to fight off the darkness. So that's the high level of story. We, of course, because this is an educational game, had some learning objectives. So one, we were really interested in making a game-based climate change curriculum. Climate change is just a never-ending, impending doom upon our society. And so how might we start to help our young people think about ways that they might be able to kind of thwart it right now? This also helped promote some STEM pathways, so science, tech, engineering, and math, with our middle school students. Because we're also coming back from the pandemic, we wanted to think about hybrid formats of education. So what are they going to be doing in their classrooms? And how might they also use the online format to engage in education? And as Patrick has mentioned, we've been doing ARGs for quite a while. And so we're curious about what does it mean to make ARGs for young people, to scale that up, and then think about, well, how might we incorporate the larger, let's say, Chicago school population, and then really expand that outside of Chicago. And then really to think about if ARGs are these kind of networked experiences, and climate change is a kind of networked wicked problem, how might we actually think about how these games can be helpful to help solve these problems? Oh, wonderful. So the game lasted for about 2.5 weeks. Each school had 4 future worlds that they would interact with. So we might have a world where everyone lives in kind of like a flotilla, or everyone flies, or a world full of mushrooms. And so they were all kind of fantastical and speculative. We also worked with an artist, Sarah Gavigan, who made all of the concept art that the students would see and interact with. So it really kind of helped boost their imagination. We would have students interact with these worlds for about 2.5 days. Each quest had 20 worlds. Each world had 20 quests. But to kind of help us not go crazy, trying to produce so many quests for all these students, we would kind of use the same formats of quests, but kind of reskin them a little bit to each of the different worlds. And one of the main things that we did was work really closely with UChicago faculty, who are experts in either climate change or new media or science, and really kind of had them at the forefront to kind of open people up to these new worlds. And so I believe we have a video that will show in just a second.
Scene begins with a call to action.
We're getting these messages from the Forecast Lab.
And we're like, oh my gosh, what is this?
If we are able to complete the Keeper's game, we just might have a shot at stopping the darkness.
Scene is an alternate reality game.
But like a knowledgeable game. So you're like learning about climate change.
With Scene, we were able to take it to the next level.
3 different schools.
More than 300 students.
Real-time live streaming interaction. 2,500 quests.
You're completing these quests to fight off the darkness.
I'm getting full engagement from every student.
A lot of opportunities to just open up their minds on like what science is.
This is accessible to all students.
The transmedia component allows for the concept of climate change to be more fully realized.
I think our generation can change the future a lot.
By everyone just doing something small.
It's not like I feel I can change the future, it's that I know I can change the future.
Okay, so we had, just to kind of provide a high level structure, we had 3 different middle schools that we engaged. We had a charter school, a private school, and then a public school. So Bret Harte was our public school, UChicago Woodlawn Charter is the charter school, and then Lab School, which is connected to UChicago, was our private school. We had 12 worlds in general. These are the structures that we provided to each of the students, and all of them had, again, different flavors that they would interact with. So for instance, like we had a world just full of water, or a world that would exist on the moon. And each of those numbers that you see for those worlds represented the time period that we were in. So Water 2067 was the year that students would be interacting with through our game. Next slide, please. We also, like I said before, had introductory faculty videos. So you kind of saw the format of, you saw our colleague Heidi Coleman wearing these super cool blue lab coats, talking directly to a screen to our players. We did that same exact thing with our colleagues. So we had Catherine Buse, who is one of the new faculty members here in Cinema Media Studies at UChicago, talk about virtual worlds. And then we had another colleague talk about utopias and what that meant. So we also had some sample quests. So this is a great example of like how people interacted. And to be very clear, the way that we had this operate, we had a website that students would check every day. They would be able to see videos. And on this website, they would also see the text of the quests there. And then Patrick will talk a little bit more about the live streaming component in a moment. But for instance, in the mushroom world, we had people create a short twine game that would show, why fungi are important to fighting climate change. And so we worked really closely with their science teachers to make sure that we were using the appropriate vocabulary that they're learning that week, so that they could take that vocabulary, go deeper with it, and then actually play around with it and make a game. So what would it look like for them to make a game that would build on the network that mushrooms use to communicate? How can that be useful to thwarting climate change? Or what would it look like to compose an original song? In Sonic World 2130, they can make a song that would talk about climate change. That's something that's catchy and fun. So we were also very mindful of the fact that some of our students might be more focused on science or tech, but some might be more artistic. But all of these ways are helpful for us to start thinking about how we can, collectively start bringing awareness around climate change, or awareness of new modes of interaction with our classmates and also the world. We also worked with Sandy Weiss, so he runs the Mystery League here in Chicago. And so we had a bunch of puzzles. And so some of our quests also, focused on, well, what would it look like to, again, think about vocabulary, but in a playful way. So we had quests where the answer would require them to know what the Anthropocene is, and, how would they, what are two baby sheeps called? What are two baby deer called, and how can you actually construct the Anthropocene, and what does that even mean? We also had quests that would require maps, and that if you connect the cities together, you might spell out CO2. What does that mean? How does that affect the world that we live in? So again, just playing around with the different modes and the different ways of thinking was really important to us.
And these puzzles were, the puzzles themselves weren't necessarily linked to climate change. They were just like various forms of transmedia puzzles. But the solutions, as Ashlyn was saying, yielded things like Anthropocene or CO2, which would then lead to other games and other challenges that the youth had to undertake in order to define these words or imagine various futures with them. So the piece that I'll talk about also is the theater piece, right? So part of our work doesn't just have to do with kind of quests and educational engagements, but also thinking about how to introduce performance and improvisation into games in more robust ways, like building on LARPs, building on ARGs and pervasive games, and so forth. And we're particularly interested in moments of emergent narratives, so moments in which the story goes in a direction that we wouldn't have expected, and in which there are substantive contributions being made by the players, in this case, the middle schoolers. We're also interested in moments of collaboration between actors and audiences, which I'll talk a little bit about. Because we were working with young people, we were in some ways more interested in process than production. If we could open up a very simple chat room and produce a vibrant set of conversations with a character, we were going to do that, even if it was just going to be a chat room, and maybe we didn't have like a full live streaming setup or a set at that particular moment. So NetProv was a big part of this game. When it came to climate change, we were also interested in the process of game making and game playing as problem finding rather than problem solving. It's not like we think any game is going to solve climate change. I mean, this is like a multi-generational problem in some ways. Unsolvable. It can be mitigated in many ways, but we wanted to figure out, like, what is the best way to even think about climate change? What do they care about as middle schoolers? So we were really kind of trying not only to motivate them to learn more about this, but thinking about where their interest already was. And finally, in all of the games that we've produced over time, we're always interested in the role of genre in marking expectations and opportunities for departing from those expectations. So when we made The Parasite, for instance, which was a game for college students, our genre was that of a secret society, because many incoming college students were familiar with Skull and Bones or with secret societies from different television shows that they had watched. And secret societies are really problematic in the sense that they engage in hazing and kind of like self-reproduction, which is sometimes why they appear in already kind of like elite and privileged institutions. And our narrative was very much about a secret society that did the exact opposite of that, right? Didn't self-reproduce itself, but engaged in self-obsolescence in order to make the future of different groups, especially marginalized groups who hadn't been represented at universities like the University of Chicago historically, better. So in this game as well, we were playing with the genres of dystopia, utopia, and various forms of weird and speculative fiction. The transmedia storytelling component started with what Ashlyn was describing in terms of this story about the possibility space and the keepers. We also imagined a team of villains in this case. So it was a team of a group called the Veilers, who existed in a parallel Earth, who have this kind of combination of business attire and police attire in some way, right? So we were a little bit biased in terms of like how we shaped our villains in this case, but the villains were being played by some of our undergraduates who engaged in a 6-week internship and were able to learn some things about game making in the process. And one of the coolest moments was in the last week of the game, every single night, a few of us would go online, and for an hour, we would talk to any of the middle schoolers who wanted to be in this public chat room. And they could go on there and ask us about the quests, they could get advice, we could talk about climate change, and that part of the conversation was really great. But then one day we had a couple of undergraduates come in net probbing as these villains, as these Veilers, and suddenly they hacked into the chat, and this created really interesting moments of storytelling in which the middle schoolers started defending themselves and fighting against these villains in a variety of ways. And in the conversation, a number of new plot points emerged that we hadn't initially planned on. So this was a way of encouraging contributions from the players and then subsequently incorporating them into the finale of the game. So the finale of the game was a 60-minute live action sequence. It was a little bit longer than that, but 60 minutes of really, really intense kind of interaction where all 350 students signed in from their respective schools, some on their phones, some on shared laptops, and were able to make contributions. We also had a few live actors who were present in a set. So we worked a lot about on what it means to act for a live streaming context, which is very different than acting for live theater or acting for film, right? There's a different kind of proximity, there's a different kind of speed in interacting and encouraging the audience to make contributions. So this was one of our wonderful actors, Madeline, who played one of the key parts. And these are a couple of views of what the players saw that day when they were interacting. So the image on the left shows a couple of the keepers, who were kind of like the good, positive characters interacting with the players. Occasionally text would appear that Madeline would either read aloud or summarize, and the students had access to it. And occasionally we get a view like on the right where the keepers were engaging in a ritual that had to do with all of these possible worlds. And this is a view from a moment in that finale in which the Veilers came in, stormed into the possibility space, and threatened to take over all of the possible worlds. So this was a moment in which the players had to save the keepers from at home. So it was a very simple narrative in some ways, in terms even of the kind of like melodramatic binary between the heroes and the villains. But this worked in terms of like clearly communicating with the middle schoolers in a very short duration of live interaction. So what did they do? I mean, I'll give you just one example, which is they engaged in real-time votes and choices between worlds. So as this force, the darkness, was eating away at possible worlds, there were moments where students who had engaged in these worlds for weeks with their quests had to make a choice about which worlds to sacrifice and which ones to keep. So the choices were meaningful in the sense of losing something in the choice. So they might get a choice between the non-human world and the mushroom internet world. Well, I mean, you know, that one would have been a little bit easier because the non-human world didn't involve the middle schoolers, and they very much wanted to be a part of the action. So if they had chosen the mushroom world, they might have gotten text like this. It might say, you chose mushroom 2747. Now here's your problem of imagination. Problem. If humans replaced the 2022 energy-intensive internet, which depends on servers and cloud computing, with an organic mushroom-based communication network in the future, then what is the most exciting possibility you could imagine? And then they would get these 4 very short pieces of text that they would have to choose among. And because the strange bar keeps appearing at the bottom, I'm now unable to see. But let me see if I can move it for a second. So. The choices would be solution to global warming, the idea of this being, you know, like a less energy intensive way of communicating, mushrooms as alien technology, so the idea of really engaging fungi as another kind of like life form, new web of life, so thinking about interconnection, and then food as technology. And each of these choices would produce a different text and different narrative information than what they would otherwise get. And they would only get one of these pieces of text. There was also part of the interaction where we had a really amazing sculptor, Sam Rausch, and she created these sculptures that abstractly represented each of the 12 worlds. And at key moments, players had to identify those sculptures with the worlds that they had already played, and then make choices about whether to keep or lose those worlds in different ways. I'll be very brief about this. You know, like overall, this 60-minute segment, I think, had limitations and possibilities. The biggest limitation was the difficulty of managing 350 middle schoolers in real time via live streaming chat. The chat was immensely interactive. I mean, that was the good part of it, but the young players, at least a couple of them, really wanted to test the limits. And so there were moments of like text spamming and stuff like that. We have solutions to that going forward, but it didn't always work out ideally in this performance. There were also limits of there not being physical interactions between the actors and the players. Everything happened for us online in websites, text, and via live streaming. However, the timed voting with dynamic outcomes produced a lot of excitement and suspense among players. Also, the players themselves interacted in person via their teams at their schools prior to this live action finale. And that produced a lot of exciting world building and camaraderie. So there was actually a lot of qualitative input that the players had throughout the 2.5 weeks, even if the finale was a little bit more controlled in terms of a binary voting system. I'll turn it back to Ashlyn.
All right, so we're gonna kind of speed through this. I want to see if there's any questions. We had quite a few students participating, roughly like 300 plus between all of our schools. We had so many quests that we, created. We had 240 unique quests, but like when I tell you, like we had so many quests submitted, like I die a little inside every time I think about evaluating them, but I'm always like so excited because we had 2,500 quests submitted between all of our students, which says that they were really engaged in this work. And so I will happily always like do these quests, and also our interns helped with that. And so there were a lot of, great responses about the possibility of change and what that means. So one student was saying, one thing I learned about climate change from the game was that just one person is able to start a word around the worlds for millions, of people around globally to contribute into changing climate change. So they're really saying like, hey, I can start something and then we can start catalyzing a bunch of people to help with climate change. I can't read the other one. But some things that we like think about all the time as we create ARGs, and we pose these questions to you all if you're interested in this, is like thinking about how long an interaction is, or how long interactive story bits are. Are they serial? Are they just one long performance? Are there rabbit holes? For this time, we had a rabbit hole, but also note that we worked directly with people that the young people trusted. They're science teachers, right? And so the rabbit hole is a little bit different than, let's say, I have a poster with a weird date and expecting people to kind of come to it on their own. Our trusted people help to guide our players into the solution. How many worlds do you have? How many interaction forms do you have across media? Our young people are really savvy of navigating a bunch of different things, but as designers, we have to be mindful of like all the things that we have to keep in mind. How open is the story? How much can you co-create, and how well can you integrate what the students have created back into your game, into your narrative, right? Sometimes that requires a lot of work, and then sometimes it might just be super simple. It really depends on your narrative, but those are some things that we think about. Thanks for listening. Questions, concerns, criticisms, compliments.
We've got 4 minutes here before Ryan takes the stage, so we're going to first ask Celia to ask her question, and then we're going to roll through what we've got as much as well as possible.
Yeah, I put it in this. That was fantastic, but I put it in text in all caps. How in the hell did you fund this?
Patrick, answer it.
That is a very good question. So, most of the funding came internally from the university. I mean, there's this like competition through something called the Neubauer Collegium, where you can apply for research money. Part of the reason that we've been doing more of these kind of educational games and not kind of games that are, like art or theater first, is there are more mechanisms for potentially funding them through, say, the NEA or the NEH or private foundations, or sometimes internally within the university. In order to do that, we always have to promise kind of qualitative or even quantitative evaluation. And there's a lot of fighting in terms of like, is this research or not? And we think that it's research even prior to the moment of the kind of social scientific evaluation, right? In the way that, for instance, folks in Canada think about art as research creation. That's very much the way that we think about these projects. But because we've also been working with a very tight crew, a smaller and smaller team in some ways, we were able to do this like fairly inexpensively compared to like the early projects that we started working on. Because again, I mean, we did have undergraduate students, but the core team was basically made up of 5 or 6 people total.
Man. And again, I see this as a 6-cylinder production where you're not only like interested in game design, but also interested in saving the world, also as a concrete task that you're carrying through, and working with the middle schoolers, and working with a variety of different factors. So I think all of those of us who are in the field working had our jaws on the floor for most of this talk. I just want to say that. I think one very direct question was how long it took for you to develop this.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Ash, I mean, do you have a sense of this? Time is such a blur to me post-COVID that I like.
Is an illusion. But I'll say, so I think that there's a couple ways we can think about this. I think because we're a close-knit group of people who've been working with each other for at least 5 to 6 years, this is like a thing that we're always kind of talking about and always kind of thinking about. So that's one thing that's great about working with a close set of collaborators, where you're just kind of like constantly in brainstorming idea mode and constantly thinking about the next experience. And so we could even say that Terrarium, our first kind of climate change game for undergrads, we were already at that moment in 2019 saying like, okay, but what about middle school students? So you could say, like, we've been thinking about that for 3 years, but if we want to get really practical about like how much time it took to just like work on it, probably I would say 6 to 7 months of like actual, like, we're kicking out quests, we're building a website, we're coming up with the script, but a little bit more time because I think that, you know, between like Patrick, you were working closely with Heidi to like really get teachers on board.
Yeah.
That is a whole process within itself. So, you know,
Yeah.
6 months plus however much time it took you all to like talk to them.
Yeah,
I mean,
I would say we started like that summer talking to the teachers and the schools, because there was a lot of politics and just like getting in there and replacing a science curriculum for 2.5 weeks. Yeah, I mean, the production itself was maybe was even 5 months in some ways, but it's true there was this whole atmosphere to the thing that preceded it. Yeah.
And here's where I say Indicate has told me time. So at this point, I'd like to thank both of you. And I really want you to take anything else into the Discord because I think you have a very active audience interest in your accomplishments here. So again, this is mostly just being fair to our presenters and our audience, but I really appreciate what you've brought into the space. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Celia, and everyone. Parker, thanks.